This webinar is hosted through the New England Prevention Technology Transfer Center, the New England PTTC, which is a program funded through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration through a cooperative agreement. The PTTC provides training and technical assistance services to prevention professionals and stakeholders in the 6 New England states. Products include in-person, distance learning, and online trainings, as well as prevention tools and resources. The New England PTTC is one of 10 regional centers and 2 national focus area centers providing these services across the country. You can learn more about the New England PTTC or other PTTC regions at our website, pttcnetwork.org. The PTTC network uses affirming language to promote the application of evidence-based and culturally informed practices. The use of affirming language inspires hope. Language matters. Words have power. People first. We invite you to incorporate these practices into your own work as well. Without further ado, I am going to hand it over to today's presenters. We're very excited to have them here for this topic. Very relevant in today's day and age. So I want to welcome Cassandra Greisen Torre. I forgot to ask. Torre, who's the Director of Public Policy at NABCA. Carrie, Christofes, who's the Executive Director of the National Liquor Law Enforcement Association, and Matthew Stemple, who's a Special Agent with the North Carolina Department of Public Safety Alcohol Law Enforcement Division. So I am going to now hand it over to Cassie, who's going to start us off today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristen. And it's Tori. So now you have a sense of how to pronounce it. Cassie, Greisen, Tori. Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to help. So as Kristen did a nice introduction of the panel here, we are really delighted to bring this information to you regarding direct-to-consumer. That's what the DTC stands for, direct-to-consumer alcohol sales in the era of COVID-19, enforcement and policy challenges. So the way the structure will go, I'll start, we'll pass it over to Carrie, and then Matt will wrap it up, and we'll open it up for Q&A thereafter. And just a little bit about my component. I'll be talking primarily about alcohol regulation and the context and the landscape as it exists today. So I am here as the Director of Public Policy for the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association, and my guess is a large portion of the audience today maybe has never heard of the organization, and so I just want to give you some context to who this organization is and who my organization is and what our primary role is. So we were established right after the federal repeal of federal prohibition in 1938. We represent our governing board members, our control jurisdictions, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. But those are states that really have a direct role in some part of the sales cycle, whether that be at the wholesale level or at the retail level. Some trade associations do advocate, but NABCA does not advocate, but it's also not a lobbying group. Although I will say, when I say the name, sometimes people think that we are, but the point here is we try to walk right down the line to share research and science and information about alcohol regulation and have a balanced approach to that. And we're not a beverage alcohol industry organization either. So that just gives you a little bit of footing as to who we are. So I want to make sure that we're starting from the same place in our understanding. And I think this will not surprise anyone on this webinar, but the Constitution actually has 2 references to alcohol. It's the only product that actually has two amendments that the Constitution has addressed. And of course, that's the 18th Amendment that instituted federal prohibition and the 21st Amendment that repealed it. But the other thing the 21st Amendment did was give the primary jurisdiction over to the states. And the states then get to decide how they want to regulate and tax alcohol. And that's why we see such variation across the country. And I think it's been quite pronounced in the current moment of the pandemic that we've seen a lot of different policy changes happening. And that's in part because of the 21st Amendment allows and provides that opportunity for states to have that primary jurisdiction. So because we're doing this for the New England PTTC, we thought it would be helpful to provide some background on a sort of a side-by-side state comparison. And so what you're seeing here are the states that comprise the New England PTTC region. And I want to walk through them just briefly, but what you're going to see here in the blue are control jurisdictions, control states, those states that are market participants selling the product either at wholesale or retail or both. And in the orange, these are license states, where states have given the full authority to the private sector to sell the product at every tier of the sales cycle. And the other thing you're seeing here reflected is where the primary regulatory body exists. Is it so in New Hampshire, for example, it's under the office of the governor, and same for Vermont, whereas in Massachusetts, it's under the treasurer, or in Rhode Island, the Department of Business Regulation. And this is helpful to know where your primary alcohol regulation is housed, because as you want to engage in these conversations about rulemaking processes or even just introduce yourself, you need to know who has that authority. And that particular authority does licensing, and in some cases that authority also does the enforcement. And when I say enforcement, there are two types of enforcement, and Carrie will talk about this more, but there's administrative enforcement of the Administrative Alcohol Code, and that's really important to understand because that's usually exclusively about the sale of the product and regulating the sale of the product and preventing illegal alcohol sales. Oh, there we go. And but there's also, in some cases, the jurisdiction has police powers as well. And where those jurisdictions where there isn't police powers, in addition to the administrative powers, they still exist in the state. It's just that it's in an outside agency. So where you see the little shield, that's indicating in that particular state, they have both administrative and criminal powers to do enforcement. And that becomes very relevant because when you have, typically administrative enforcement is housed within the ability to enforce rules and regulations specific to alcohol on the premise of the establishment. And when you have the criminal code opportunity, that allows you to then also have the opportunity to enforce the parameter around the license establishment. And I know Carrie will go into more detail about that, but that's just a high-level overview and a snapshot of what you see here in Region 1, the New England PTTC. So alcohol regulation changes are happening at all branches of government, and all of the regulatory authorities I just referenced are under the executive branch, and a lot of these executive orders that we've been hearing much about during the COVID pandemic have been driven by governors who are in the executive branch. And I would say before COVID, most of these changes were happening at the legislative branch, and the judicial branch plays a role as well, and that has come into focus more recently in the last, I would say, 15 years, where the courts have really provided opportunity for the expansion of alcohol availability, and in some ways the loosening of that has permitted these types of practices we'll be talking about today in terms of home delivery. So alcohol regulation impacts all 4 Ps of, and the 4 Ps of marketing that we often think about when you think about the marketplace: price, promotion, product, and place. And today we're going to talk a lot about place being home delivery, but alcohol regulation impacts all 4 of these, and I've listed a couple of ways that happens. I don't have time to go into great depth here, but I do want to share that public health and safety is a primary role in preventing public health and safety, or protecting rather public health and safety is a primary role for alcohol regulators. And there are a number of other factors that alcohol regulation has to take into account. These are sort of the pillars of alcohol regulation, if you will. So first, as I mentioned, protecting the public health and safety. That is why regulation exists, is to ensure that we are protecting the public in the context of this is a legal product and getting it to market. However, we need to make sure that that's done safely and the public is safe and the consumers are safe. Ensuring efficient tax collection. We have a very strong system in this country to collect those taxes and revenues, and that's a really strong role for an alcohol regulator to ensure. Eliminating unfair and illegal market practices is another, and then balancing all the very, very varied interests that exist around the sale and service of alcohol. So regardless of if you are in a controlled jurisdiction or a licensed jurisdiction, there are sort of common threads throughout all of these states. Every state licensed somebody to sell the product. Every state is enforcing laws to reduce underage and excessive drinking. They're regulating the different mechanisms of availability with days and hours of sale, location of the premise, and in the density and the concentration of those outlets. And they're requiring products to flow through a 3-tier system. And this 3-tier system is really important to understand because it will come up later on in the presentation. But that the 3-tier system is, as you can see on the right side here, a producer, wholesaler, and the retailer. And I like to think about this like an hourglass. You have the producers at the top, then you have the wholesalers in the middle, and then it fans back out to the retailers. And this slide depicts why these 3 tiers are so important. And I'm going to focus on the middle tier, the wholesale tier, because this is where the hourglass goes in and streamlines, if you will. This is where we can ensure that if there's tainted product that gets into the market, we can easily track it and pull it back off the shelves to protect consumers. Very important to be able to do that. It's also the primary location where tax collection occurs. And as I noted earlier, we have near 100% tax collection in this country because of this 3-tier system. Other countries cannot say that, and it's really important that we work to protect that. And then finally, preventing illegal sales. At the retail tier, they must prevent the sale to minors and intoxicated persons, and that becomes really, really important when we think about home delivery. And the other important piece here I would just make a comment to is that the idea here is that any one of these tiers are not supposed to have ownership in more than one tier, and to avoid that vertical integration. And that vertical integration, if you've ever heard me speak before, is something that led to a lot of consumption and aggressive sales tactics prior to prohibition. So there's been an intention after federal prohibition repeal to ensure that that doesn't come back. And that vertical integration of these tiers did have an impact on aggressive sales tactics, and so the 3-tier system being intact was one way to try to address that issue. So moving on to home delivery, which you're all here to talk about, and I already went over the basics of the 3-tier system, so but I just want to sear it in your brain because it's extremely important. And I know that if you haven't studied alcohol regulation for as many years as I have, you maybe never even heard of the 3-tier system, but it's important to know that it operates in the background and does in fact provide a lot of safety to the public, but also to the consumer. So we're going to look at 2 different forms of home delivery today. The first is through direct shipping of alcohol, and that's when a producer, through a common carrier, and currently these are the two common carriers that do permit alcohol deliveries, so FedEx and UPS. USPS isn't currently in as a common carrier that does permit alcohol deliveries. So these are the two, and then through the common carriers, they deliver it to the consumer. And as you can see here, this removes the wholesale tier and the retail tier. And as we noted earlier about the importance of the wholesale tier for tax collection and being able to track tainted products when they enter the marketplace is critical. And then the retailer being able to have the training with its employees to ensure illegal sales don't occur, both to underage, but also to intoxicated adults. This is a report, this is data from the report to Congress, the 2018 report to Congress. The data you see reflected here is from 2017. So clearly this is a fast moving area of policy. So it's already out of date, but it's the best data we have in a comprehensive snapshot to see what's happening across the country. And it does give us a stamp in time before so many changes started happening before in the midst of the pandemic. But here you can see that the states that permit direct shipping of alcohol, and of course, if you follow alcohol regulation, you know that the way we regulate alcohol differs by beverage product. So more states, as you can see, those that permit direct shipping do permit wine, and there are some that do beer and wine, and there are a handful that do permit all beverage category, beer, wine, and spirits. And then there are fewer here in the salmon color that do wine and spirits only. And then there are a few that at 2017 did not permit direct shipping at all. So when we're looking at home delivery through the direct shipping mechanism, there are a number of regulatory levers to protect the public that my members and regulators in your state have to consider and have at their disposal. One, of course, is licensing those direct shippers. So the producers who want to direct ship into a state, or if they're in the state and want to direct ship, so they have in-state and out-of-state option in some cases, although that's varied state to state, but they can license those folks. There's also something called fulfillment centers, which is sort of a middleman, if you will, to get the product to market. And you can license the fulfillment centers. You can also license the common carriers, which then permits you to require reporting so that you can cross-reference the shipments that you have from your licensed shippers, but also cross-reference to make sure you don't have unlicensed shippers coming into the marketplace that you did not permit. And you can do that when you have those reports from the common carriers of UPS and FedEx. You also have the opportunity to require training of common carriers, their delivery drivers, for example, and that they know best practices for carding and the importance of that. You can require that it contains alcohol on the package so that it's very clear to the delivery driver, this is an alcohol product. And finally, the tracking mechanism to trace products through the supply chain channel. So these various components that I've raised allow the regulator, again, charged with protecting the public in their process of getting the product to market, that they are able to track these various pieces in the supply chain to make sure that that product is getting safely is transferred in the market safely, but also that it's not getting into the hands of those who shouldn't have it, like somebody who's underage. So now shifting gears to an area that I think has a lot of people's attention right now, home delivery through third-party delivery apps and other online platforms. So in this case, you can see that the three-tier system stays intact with the producer, the wholesaler, and the retailer. And then this is where it gets a bit a lot of variety, because in some cases, the retailer permits its employee to then take it to the consumer. In other cases, they use a platform like Drizzly, that I think many of us are probably familiar with at this point, to facilitate the sale. And then the employee takes it to the consumer, the retail employee. And then there are the third-party food delivery apps like Uber Eats, Instacart, Amazon. There are many others I think we all know, but the point here is these are other mechanisms in which are being used in states to get the product to the consumer. And the STOP Act reports this data as well, although an important caveat to this data, which is from 2017 as well, that's featured in their 2018 report to Congress, that this is only reflecting when a retailer's employees deliver the product. This does not track whether third-party delivery drivers are permitted to deliver the product. So it's just an important distinction. And you can see here that in 2017, there were a fair number of states that did not permit this type of activity for a retailer to do home delivery of any beverage category. And those that did permit it, those states that did, they largely were permitting all beverage category, beer, wine, and spirits. And so some of the regulatory levers in this case for retail third-party delivery is you can license the third-party delivery vendor. You can license the third-party delivery vendor's drivers. Licensing of the retailers, of course, to have that additional privilege to be able to allow their employees to home deliver. And training on carding practices for all those potential delivery drivers, any of those vendors. And then there is a question here, and now I know, for example, in North Carolina, and that's who we're going to hear from later, there is a need to identify, who has the liability when issues arise. If there is a sale to a minor, is it the third-party vendor? Is it the delivery driver? Is it the retailer where the product originated from? These are important questions as regulations are being crafted and as laws are being drafted. These are really important questions to be answering. So turning to the pandemic, and so NAVCA has created quite a bit of tracking. Rachel Coe in our office has taken primary charge on this, and these are interactive dashboards. So we update them almost daily to track all the different changes that are happening for restaurants, for bars, which are the on-premise locations that are experiencing the bulk of the changes. And then we do have a dashboard that reflects off-premise licensed establishments and the changes we're seeing, although it's not as varied as you see for the on-premise. So I took a couple screenshots from our dashboards, which you can find at navca.org. From our homepage, you can get to the dashboards. But this is just for restaurants, but again, we have it for bars and we also have it for off-premise locations. So looking first at curbside pickup, again, for restaurants, this gives you a snapshot as of today, what is happening with curbside pickup of alcohol in the jurisdictions. And there's a legend that helps explain what's happening here, but is food required with the curbside pickup? We're tracking that. We're letting you know if it varies by locality. We're also just out of the gate letting you know if it is permitted or if it's not. And also if it was permitted prior to COVID, we've been trying to track that too, just to put it in context. And with this, you can see spirits to go. So this is a topic area that is really got a lot of headlines and has been an area of focus for many. And this is also, again, just specific to restaurants that I'm focusing on here, but we have them for other on-premise outlets as well. But here you're seeing if spirits-based drinks to go for curbside are permitted and the various requirements. And then on the right side, you're seeing it for home delivery. And we're also noting here, if the state does permit spirits-based drinks to go, that if they have to have a manufactured seal, because that's where the regulatory levers are to protect the public as well. Clearly, there are concerns with products being sealed properly, and is that done by the manufacturer or is it done by the retailer? And how does that get to the consumer? These are all important questions to be answered as rules and regulations are being drafted. And I know as you think about, from the prevention community engaging in these conversations, which I encourage you to engage in these conversations in your respective states, because regulators do need to hear from prevention and public health experts on these considerations. I know in Iowa, for example, the Alcohol Prevention Research Center that's based in Illinois created some helpful resources around what are good mechanisms for sealed containers. And the Department of Public Health then helped, had that information and shared it with the Iowa Alcoholic Beverage Division. So there are opportunities to engage in these conversations. Recently in Oregon, I know they had a potential rule to extend hours for a longer duration during the midst of the pandemic, and the Oregon Health Authority weighed in on that. So the formal rulemaking process can be an opportunity to engage in those conversations, to share your expertise, but you don't have to wait for that formal process, because the door is open from regulators to hear from you, and you should be engaging in those conversations. So just to kind of pull it back, and I just want to say that, before I pass it over to Carrie here shortly, it's what does it all mean? So we do have increased access and availability happening through home delivery. We have that was happening before COVID, but it has certainly been expedited in the midst of the pandemic. So in doing that, it does raise considerations for enforcement and monitoring challenges, and how are we handling that? And Carrie will be speaking about that a bit more specific to enforcement. And finally, what kind of resources do we have to ensure that we're able to prevent harm, that we're able to protect consumers from tainted products in the market, that we're able to collect those taxes, and that we're able to make sure we have a safe and fair marketplace by routine monitoring and compliance? These are all important questions, and I hope you get some of these answers as we work through this webinar today. And finally, just another plug for the COVID resources. We created them for a reason. We want you to use them, but we have a lot of other areas of expertise in terms of just knowing alcohol regulation and keeping our finger on the pulse of what's happening across the country. So please consider us a resource, and my contact information is there below, and happy to answer any questions if you ever have them. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm going to take over now. I am Carrie Christofes, of the Executive Director of the National Liquor Law Enforcement Association. Before I get into my portion of today's presentation, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about who I am and my experience in relation to today's topic. I have been with NLLEA for a year and a half now, so I'm a little bit new to this position, and a lot of you might not know me or have met me or even know what the National Liquor Law Enforcement Association does. So I have worked both in enforcement and prevention, having 6 years in law enforcement and over 15 years working for a single county authority in the state of Pennsylvania, where I oversaw alcohol, tobacco, and other drug prevention for 3 counties. I managed several grants to include the Enforcing the Underage Drinking Grant, the old UDL grants, some of you might remember, and a Drug-Free Communities grant, where our main focus was environmental prevention to reduce underage drinking. So today I'm going to talk to you about the NLLEA and how your communities can partner with your state alcohol law enforcement or regulatory authorities. We are a nonprofit organization. Our membership is mainly made up of alcohol law enforcement and regulatory agencies, along with local, state, and university police departments. We currently have a membership from 40 states and the District of Columbia in Canada. We would love to have membership from all 50 states and expand our reach more into local and university law enforcement. So if you're working with any of these entities, please encourage them to check out our association. We do have a website at NLLEA.org. So the NLLEA, we are considered the national voice with expertise on all matters related to alcohol law enforcement. Our trainers are subject matter experts in alcohol law enforcement, and therefore promote best practices in alcohol law enforcement. And those would be for things like alcohol age compliance checks, licensee inspections, and place of last drink. And more recently, we're doing work around direct-to-consumer compliance, age compliance checks with home delivery, and cocktails to go. I think we're ahead one slide, so I briefly just wanted to go over the map. The blue states are the states we have membership from. The red, we still need to recruit. So in your region, that would be Rhode Island and Connecticut. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of alcohol law enforcement to provide you a foundation. Every state is different in how their enforcement of alcohol regulatory guidelines are structured. Some have their own enforcement and some use state and local police. So in a 2005 report, this is made available by NHTSA. It's entitled The Role of Alcohol Beverage Control Agencies in the Enforcement and Adjudication of Alcohol Laws. There's a chart that describes how each state's alcohol law enforcement is structured. Some of this information is dated, but it will provide you a good basis and understanding of how this is set up among the states. There are three main typologies of how alcohol law enforcement is structured in the states. Most are housed within the Alcohol Regulatory Agency, and I know Cassie talked about this a little bit. And this would be, an example of this would be Vermont, Department of Liquor and Lottery, Division of Liquor Control, and they are the Office of Compliance and Enforcement. And some are within their state's Department of Public Safety. This is how North Carolina is set up, which you'll hear from Matt later. It's the North Carolina Alcohol Law Enforcement Division, which is under the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. And then some are at the county and local level, like Maryland and Hawaii. And to break it down a bit further, which I won't get into each agency, or we could probably be here all day, alcohol law enforcement agencies differ too on their enforcement powers. Some are fully sworn police officers, as Cassie said, with the ability to enforce both the liquor code and the criminal code. Others are not and can only enforce the liquor code or administrative code, and they work collaboratively with their state and local enforcement on matters that involve incidents at licensed establishments outside of their realm of authority. So I'm going to jump back and talk a little bit more about our services. So some of the services that the NLLEA provides its membership and other partnering agencies include the collection and dissemination of law enforcement data. This is accomplished both externally by sharing of information among the states and internally through NLLEA survey collection and compilation. And I'll talk a little bit more about some surveys we've done in the next couple of slides. But our membership does provide us with diverse knowledge and expertise on many challenges facing alcohol law enforcement. And this was both in pre and current COVID circumstances. These are some of the challenges that alcohol law enforcement has been working through more recently. Enforcement capacity challenges are not a new issue, but needs to become an issue that we research more and talk about more in light of loosening regulations in response to COVID. I encourage coalitions that are doing evaluation to gather those statistics for their states and communities and paint the picture, keeping in mind the time and effort that goes into ensuring that direct shipping and home delivery of alcohol is being conducted lawfully, especially with the expansion of alcohol availability and accessibility beyond just brick and mortar licensed establishments. The demand on alcohol law enforcement resources has hit a crescendo, and we need to show this through our data. So an example of that, and I want to highlight one of the surveys that the NLLEA conducted over the past year. This survey collected information on alcohol law enforcement salary guidelines and officer to outlet ratios. This is the state of Maine, and as you can see, Maine reports 1 inspector to every 954 outlets. The number of inspectors has remained constant at 5 full-time inspectors, but the number of outlets has almost doubled. And Maine's not the only state working through these capacity challenges. Another survey we conducted, and I'm just giving you a high-level overview, was to formulate some baseline data for direct-to-consumer shipping and home delivery of alcohol. This is just one question from the survey, just to show you some of the challenges alcohol law enforcement is working through concerning this topic. I know this slide is hard to read, but I'll read some of these top challenges for compliance. So I know Cassie talked more in depth about this process with direct-to-consumer shipping and home delivery, but there are challenges around unlicensed or shippers not being permitted, failure to pay proper alcohol excise taxes, failure to pay proper alcohol sales taxes, failure to properly verify age of the consumer upon delivery, which is probably what you hear about the most, unauthorized alcoholic beverages, direct shipper permit holder not bottling or producing the product they sold to the consumer, overshipment of product per state limitations. Each state has their own limitations on the amount, shipping to an unapproved address, tainted product, shipping into states that don't allow out-of-state shipments, or local option communities where it's illegal to possess alcohol. And these are some of the behind-the-scenes challenges that alcohol law enforcement is working through that takes a significant amount of time to investigate when resources are already low. So again, back to some of our services and why you should partner with your state alcohol law enforcement agency or the NLLEA. We are in the process of putting together a virtual library of trainings that will be available free to our membership, but we are going to make the trainings available to those outside of alcohol law enforcement as well, setting that up for a reasonable cost. People can reach out to me to get those set up. They should be up on our website and completed hopefully by the beginning of November. And I know I've already talked to some coalitions about setting up some trainings for their local law enforcement or their state alcohol law enforcement. So those are some things that would be a great partnership. So I just want to recap a little and back up. Back in May, when our alcohol law enforcement agencies were starting to get back up and running just a little bit from the shutdown due to COVID, we had a chiefs meeting through Zoom, and we discussed some of these challenges. And by far, the home delivery of alcohol was definitely becoming a challenge, and curbside pickup, reports of, violations of alcohol being either left on a doorstep unattended, or, youth having access to alcohol, and those means with alcohol being left on the doorsteps, no verification as to age, underage youth decoys picking up to-go orders of food, of alcoholic beverages curbside. And then, thrown into all of that was face coverings, and how do we deal with doing age compliance checks now with face coverings. So this was a good way for us to kind of put something out to our membership and just remind our membership and our states that, it's still important that we do these alcohol age compliance checks, and how we can put together some best practices around that. And also just to remind our licensed establishments of how important it still is to make sure they're checking ID properly. And I'm sure some of you read the articles, like the article in the Washington Post back in May, food delivery apps, fueled alcohol sales to minors. That was through California. So we reached out to California, and they gave us some of their statistics, which were in that article. And they're still working, with their delivery services through the delivery apps and running those decoy programs. And a lot of this has been around education, educating the delivery drivers and those companies that they work for on how important it is to check those IDs. And I know Matt will talk about that here in a couple minutes. So some of the new regulations or deregulations introduced with the pandemic are more than likely to stay, and we're seeing this already with some of the new legislation that's being introduced. So how do we regulate it and engage in solutions? We need to gather the data and paint the picture, like I said. In this 2012 study that examined youth access to alcohol through online vendors, overall results showed that age verification at delivery was inconsistently conducted, and when attempted, failed about half of the time. So again, I encourage you to collect this data in your communities through the use of youth surveys. When youth are being asked where they get their alcohol, options for home delivery and curbside pickup need to be available, as this is now the new normal. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Matt, to Agent Stemple, who will provide some great information on his home delivery compliance study.
Hello, thank you all for joining. My name is Matt Stemple. I'm the Assistant Special Agent in Charge with North Carolina Alcohol Law Enforcement Division. I've been with ALE for about 12 years now. I'm stationed in the Greensboro office. Today what we're going to do is talk about alcohol delivery services and how to set up and conduct compliance checks. I'll also go over what's needed in order to conduct these compliance checks, such as an email address, accounts with various delivery services, locations to have the alcoholic beverages delivered to, a payment method, an underage person, additional law enforcement officers or personnel to assist with the compliance checks, electronic recording devices, and then we'll also go into my actual study that we did and go over the objectives, the methods, and the results of that study. So what is your goal when you conduct one of these alcohol compliance checks? That's one of the things you want to keep in mind. Is it to educate the couriers and the delivery service personnel? Or is it to discover violations and take appropriate action, whether that's through issuing citations or making arrests or issuing administrative violations? And if you issue administrative violations, who do you issue it on? Is it the courier service, the permitted establishment, or the individual itself? And it's depending on your state laws, depends on who you actually issue the administrative violation on. So one of the first things you need to, when conducting these compliance checks, is an email address. Services such as Google or Yahoo are excellent in creating a fictitious email address to use. What you'll need is one of these email addresses to sign up for these alcohol delivery services, because a lot of them, such as Postmates or Instacart, actually require you to establish an account with them before you can see how long it would take to receive a delivery at a specific location. And then the next thing you'll need is actual location for alcoholic beverages to be delivered to. It's preferable that you have a location that's actually within a 1 hour window from when you place the order. Depending on the location, some delivery services require that you place an order a day in advance or several hours in advance. One thing that I've done during our delivery service operation was to check all apartments, houses in a certain area to see how long it would take before actually trying to acquire that location. And then another thing you want to do is be cognizant of what kind of location you choose. If you're choosing a house or an apartment complex, you want to make sure that it's not in a gated area or in an area where access is otherwise limited. You want to make sure that that courier can actually find where you're at pretty easily. Another thing to consider is there a cost to use the location? A lot of times you can actually speak to management or the employees or the owners, and they'll actually let you use the location for free for a day or two to conduct your operation. One of the things that we ran into during our compliance check operations was that several of the owners or management did not want law enforcement presence at their location, even though no arrests or no citations were being made. But I think it's always best to inform them and let them know. You also want to make sure that, if you're going to record these delivery attempts, is there a location to place your recording devices, whether they're audio recording or video recording devices. And you also want to refer to your state laws to make sure that, your state's a two-party recording state, or if it's a one-party recording state, what do you need to do to record those encounters. One thing I do recommend is that you use an apartment complex that has an exterior access, so that way you can actually see where the courier is coming to and from pretty easily from the parking lot. Another thing you want to do is minimize your downtime. Again, this is important to select one of these locations that you can have the alcohol beverages delivered within a 1 hour time period. You want to be able to place an order right after receiving a delivery or right when you're about to receive a delivery, so you can get multiple deliveries done in a day. During our compliance check operations, the first operation we did, we had 4 deliveries on one day. It was the first time trying this for us. The second one, we were able to get 8. And then the third one, we were able to get 6 deliveries. And we started each day at about 10 a.m. and ended at about 6 or 7 p.m. If you're going to make 2 purchases using the same service, one right after another, you want to make sure, again, that the courier is almost at your location or has just delivered, because you don't want that same courier to then turn around and pick up additional alcoholic beverages. A payment method is another thing you want to establish. Many alcohol delivery services such as Instacart and Postmates, they do not accept prepaid credit cards. This is one thing that we had to overcome. We actually utilized a source to establish a bank account for us using undercover funds. This was a clean bank account, devoid of any personal purchases, and it was only used for the alcohol delivery service compliance checks. When you are maintaining your undercover funds, you want to make sure that you maintain your bank account statements, you save those, and also print off receipts of each alcohol delivery purchase. As far as funds go, each time it varied a little bit. We had to pay each month about $13.13 in Amazon Prime subscriptions. There was a one-time $99 Instacart subscription, and there was a $5 per month bank fee. Each transaction was actually between $15 and $30 per delivery. And then in addition to that, we paid our underage person about $10 an hour. So depending on your operations and how much you pay your underage and other factors will depend on how much each compliance check operation will cost you. And again, if you also have to pay for the apartment complex or the house, you would need to include that payment as well. Next, you'll need an underage person. When you choose an underage person, make sure that they look appropriate for their age. You don't want to choose somebody that it looks considerably older than 21. You don't want somebody that looks too young either. Ideally, they should be between 18 and 20 years old. They should have a non-expired acceptable form of identification in their possession, whether that is a ID card, driver's license, military photo ID, passport, or any other ID depending on your state's laws. And always be sure that you follow your agency's policies when selecting an underage person and signing them up. Additionally, you'll need more law enforcement officers or more personnel to assist with the operation. During our operation, I stayed outside. I wanted a view of the courier actually coming to deliver the alcohol and leaving the establishment as well, walking back towards their vehicle. We had 2 other agents inside the apartment complex. One was there solely to set up and take down and download video and audio. And then the third one was there to help maintain custody of evidence and to maintain the underage's safety. When you're placing these orders, one thing that you'll notice is that each delivery service will actually give you a photo of who the driver is, and they'll actually give you real-time GPS. So that was another benefit of being outside. I can tell when the specific courier was coming and when they were actually when they exited the vehicle, who they were. And as far as electronic recording devices, court systems are starting to increasingly rely on these audio and video recordings for prosecution. This is, again, important if you are deciding to cite or arrest these individuals. You can use covert recording devices such as body wires, body cameras, to record these interactions between not only the courier and the underage person, but also yourself and the courier as well. When using electronic recording devices, you want to make sure first that they're fully charged. I know it's a simple concept, but last thing you want is to show up to the operation and your device isn't working. You want to actually play with each device and know how to work it and how to pull the video off and record the video as well and audio. You also want to know if your electronic devices are capable of being monitored live, and you want to know who has access to audio or video. During our operation, I was able to monitor the underage's body wire, and so were the agents inside the apartment. The agents inside the apartment were also able to monitor my body wire as well. And again, you want to make sure that you're in compliance with your state law and agency policy regarding whether it's a 1 or 2 party recording state. So I'll briefly go over our alcohol compliance check study. The objective of our study was to determine sell rates or give rates to underage individuals. At this time, this was conducted in 2018 and 2019. Alcohol delivery was a pretty new thing in North Carolina. The sample from September 2018 to January 2019, we conducted 18 alcohol compliance checks on alcohol delivery services. These were conducted in the greater Charlotte and the greater Raleigh area. That's another important piece as well, because the larger cities tend to have more couriers that you can get deliveries from. If you're in a smaller town or a smaller city, you might run into the chance of getting the same courier each time. We utilized 2 different underage persons to conduct the compliance checks. One was a youthful appearing 19-year-old white male. The other one was a youthful appearing 18-year-old white male. The 19-year-old white male was used in 4 of the 18 compliance checks, and then the 18-year-old male was used in 14 of the 18 compliance checks. So the procedures for our operation, before they were scheduled, again, we wanted to make sure that we had a location that was within that 1-hour delivery service time period. Prior to completing the compliance check operation or conducting the compliance check operation, the underage person's identification was examined to ensure that they didn't possess a fictitious ID. They were instructed to present their identification if requested by the courier and to answer all questions truthfully, such as if asked their age, you would have to tell their age as well. Our orders were placed for malt beverages through Instacart, Postmates, Amazon, and Drizzly. And if presented with a age verification prompt, a fictitious date of birth was entered to ensure that the attempted delivery was made. Just a quick note, Drizzly is actually a website that connects the customer to the retailer. They do nothing more than provide data processing and just an online website. Drizzly does not offer couriers to deliver the alcohol. The actual retailer delivers the alcohol themselves. After each purchased attempt was complete, all couriers were interviewed. Data was gathered, including name, age, sex, race, prior experience working with an alcoholic beverage retailer in North Carolina. And for the purposes of this study, they were considered to have worked for a ABC licensed establishment if they had worked at a convenience store, grocery store, restaurant, bar, nightclub that had held ABC permits under North Carolina General Statute 18B 1001. Although Amazon does have brick and mortar establishments in North Carolina, they were not considered to be have experiences working in a retail establishment because they're primarily a delivery service. After each interview was completed, the couriers were informed of the 4 acceptable identifications, such as a driver's license, North Carolina special identification card, a passport, and military identification, as stated out in North Carolina General Statute 18B 302 D1. They were also reminded not to sell or give alcoholic beverages to underage and intoxicated individuals. And if the courier completed the transaction with the underage person, the courier was provided with an oral warning. No citations, no arrests, no violations took place during this time. So the potential outcomes of the compliance check, there are 4 different types of outcomes. The first one is the courier checks identification and denies delivery. In this case, in some instances, you actually see the courier relinquish control of the alcoholic beverage, whether they place it down at their feet or they actually hand it to the underage individual. If the courier denies the delivery and actually contact their corporate headquarters to inform them of that denial, they will sometimes receive a monetary reward, usually about $15. And that reward is withdrawn from the customer's bank account. In the next potential outcome, you'll see a courier actually relinquishes custody of the product, checks identification, but does not pay attention to the delivery service application notification and completes the delivery. Almost all couriers have some sort of application on their phone given to them by their company or the company that they work for. And what they do is they'll end up scanning the barcode. If the person's underage, it'll notify the courier, or it should notify the courier, that the individual is underage and to return the alcohol to the store from which it was purchased. But unfortunately, many of these couriers actually do it pretty quick and don't really pay attention to what's on the application. In this case, you'll see that. And then the third potential outcome is the courier relinquishes custody of the product, does not check identification, and completes the delivery. And the fourth type of potential outcome that you'll see when conducting alcohol delivery compliance checks is that the courier relinquishes custody of the product, checks identification, and knowingly allows the underage to keep the product. So out of 18 compliance checks that we did, there were a total of 5 cells. This was approximately 27.78% sell rate or give rate, delivery rate. Of those 18 compliance checks, there were 10 times where the alcohol was actually handed to the underage person. That includes the cells or the gives, deliveries as well. And that was approximately 55.56% give rate. Again, in 5 of those instances, the courier retrieved the alcoholic beverage from the underage and left with the alcoholic beverage. We did not consider the delivery to be complete until the courier had given the alcoholic beverage and actually walked away from the apartment, and the underage was in possession of the alcoholic beverages. So again, here's a table showing the number of alcohol delivery compliance checks, completed deliveries, times alcoholic beverages were physically handed to the underage person per delivery service as well. For Instacart, there were 6 compliance checks, 6 completed deliveries, and 2 times, excluding the cells in which the alcoholic beverages were delivered or handed to the underage. There were 5 Postmates compliance checks. There were 3 completed sales, and 1 time where the alcoholic beverage was handed to the underage, not including sales. And for Amazon, there were 5 checks, 0 completed deliveries, and 2 times where the courier handed the alcoholic beverage to the underage and later retrieved it. For Drizzly, there were 2 compliance checks, 1 completed sale. So continuing on with the results, identification was requested and presented to the courier in 16 of the 18 checks. The underage person's age was requested in 6 of the 18 compliance checks. In every instance in which the courier requested the person's age, they also checked the underage person's identification. Out of the 5 completed sales, identification was not requested in 2 attempts. In one of the completed sales, the courier scanned the underage person's identification, but according to the courier, did not see the message on their app. We saw that video. And then in that other instance, the courier used their own identification to scan the ID and completed the delivery. On table 2, there's a rate of identification checked versus not checked compared to all alcohol delivery compliance checks. In alcohol delivery compliance checks, which ended in sales, identification was checked 16 times. Out of those 16 times, there were 3 sales or 3 deliveries. It was not checked in 2 of those deliveries, and both of those ended in completed deliveries. As I mentioned before, one of the things that we took note of was whether they had prior retail experience at an ABC permit establishment. Of all Instacart alcohol compliance checks, 2 individuals had previous retail experience, 4 did not. 1 Postmates courier had previous ABC retail experience, 4 did not. Amazon, again, nobody had ABC retail experience, and both of the Drizzly couriers had ABC retail experience because, again, Drizzly connects the consumer with the actual retail establishment, and the retail establishment does their own deliveries. Of those with retail experience, there were 2 completed sales and 3 no sales. Of the no ABC retail experience, there were 3 completed sales and 10 no sales or no deliveries. So the concerns and remedies that we had, first is in over half of all the cases, the underage person was handed the alcoholic beverage. We want to make sure that before relinquishing custody of the alcoholic beverage, the courier checks identification to make sure that person is of age to receive the alcohol. In North Carolina, if you are handed an alcoholic beverage and you're underage, the person that did the handing could be charged with giving alcoholic beverage to an underage person. Again, in approximately 27.78% of compliance checks ended in deliveries. Again, check identification, make sure the person is of age. In the one instance, there was one instance which a courier who had made a delivery had a misdemeanor controlled substance conviction in the previous 2 years and was considered unsuitable pursuant to North Carolina General Statute 18B 1003C. In North Carolina, you cannot hold an ABC permit or be involved in the sale, service, distribution of alcoholic beverages if you have a misdemeanor controlled substance conviction or an alcoholic beverage conviction, not including DWI, within the previous 2 years, or if you've had a felony conviction within the previous 3 years, or a ABC permit revoked in the previous 3 years. In one of the completed sales, again, the courier knowingly gave the alcoholic beverage to the underage. Make sure that you are hiring trustworthy employees, or the courier services are hiring trustworthy employees, and ensure that the employees know the incentive for refusing to sell. I think had she known that she could return that and contact headquarters, she probably would have been, again, monetarily compensated. And there was one instance in which one service blocked our email and credit card and the entire account and prevented us from conducting compliance checks during the 3rd operation. Now, a lot of people are wondering, how do compliance checks occur during the era of COVID? more alcoholic beverages are being delivered now since people aren't going to stores or going to restaurants. If you interact with any of your courier services, one thing you might want to suggest to them is to, when checking ID, of course, everybody's wearing masks, approach the customer, have them place the ID on a clipboard, use that surface to scan the identification. You can also establish an appropriate distance and make sure that you have time to compute the age using the date of birth and scan the identification. And you can also ask the purchaser to unmask so you can compare the photo on the identification to the underage person. The purchaser can then remask and the identification can be handed back to the purchaser, and the courier can either complete or deny the delivery. And that is all I have for you all. Thank you again for watching, and I'll pass it back over to Kristen.
Great. Thank you all so much. So I want to open it up now. We do have a few minutes here for questions. There are a couple of questions here already, so I will get started with those while other people are typing theirs in. So the first question I had here, I think this would be directed to you, Cassie. When you talk about the regulatory levers, are those regulatory levers things that are required by law, or are those considered best practices?
That's a great question. And in the domain of home delivery, because it is fairly new policy arena, there are not peer-reviewed journal articles set out best practices. Although thankfully, I know NLEA is working to establish some of those through their membership of experts, who are working this kind of stuff day in, day out in their day job. But there are those regulatory levers are places where there's opportunity, whether it be through legislation or the rulemaking process before the administrative body, where you could institute those regulatory levers. And just knowing that those are opportunities for controlling an environment to ensure illegal sales don't happen, the prevention and public health community can share that type of information with those policymakers.
Great, thank you. Let's see, what do we have next? This is a question I think for probably Cassie or Carrie. We are just beginning cocktail to go inspections in Maine. Will there be any trainings from either of your organizations around this specific topic?
I can field that question. We currently aren't offering any specific trainings on cocktails to go, and maybe Matt can probably even, from his law enforcement standpoint, through the NLLEA, but I don't know if this would be a local coalition doing this training or if they're partnering with their alcohol law enforcement. My suggestion would be to partner with, whether it be your local law enforcement or your alcohol law enforcement, on what a age or a compliance check would look like around that.
I was just going to comment, Carrie. I know Vermont has done some operations around curbside pickup, which is in part how cocktails to go occur, correct?
Correct. I think they can go into some establishments you can go into as well to pick that up. But and I was just going to finish in saying, there are definitely some, I would say, guidelines out there in completing in that compliance of cocktails to go. And I think, I'm seeing each state kind of put together their own guidelines around that too. So even checking with whether it be your regulatory or your alcohol law enforcement division on those guidelines. And I know we're putting together some documentation around that too.
As far as North Carolina goes, that's not been allowed yet.
Yeah, there is one state that has permitted it permanently, that is Iowa. The rest of the states, for the most part, have some sunsetting to that particular provision at the moment. But the person, whoever asked that question, does raise, it's an important conversation about what are those regulatory levers and how will enforcement handle these new types of sales that traditionally haven't been done before.
Thank you. Another person raises the issue in terms of some of the delivery and courier services. What about when Uber drivers or the couriers themselves are underage? Is that a possibility, or how does that work in terms of, does that open up new areas for concern in enforcement?
So at least within North Carolina, we would treat them as our permittee's employee. And for on-premise establishment, you have to be at least 18 years old to deliver alcohol from the bar area to a table, and then 16 again in order to deliver it to sell it at an off-premise establishment. Now, one thing that we'd be looking at is taking into consideration, do they have an active order? Where are they going to? But that's not one thing that we've ran into yet in North Carolina. But I presume that we'd probably treat it similar.
Thank you. Let me see what else we have here. Here's a question. I'll open this to anyone. As a coalition, how would you recommend going about approaching law enforcement for a partnership in terms of working on some of these issues?
I could maybe field a little bit of that from my own experience in working with law enforcement. You kind of need to speak their language, and you're going to kind of need to meet them where they're at. So, Matt provided us a wonderful program that he's doing around home delivery of alcohol, but not maybe all enforcement or alcohol law enforcement have that capacity or that means to do that. So, just, starting with the introductions and starting with the conversation and seeing where they're at and kind of meeting them where they're at and where their needs are. And then, if your coalition would happen to have any funding that law enforcement can use, whether that be, to help them set up these age compliance checks or with any equipment, that always goes a long way as well.
Thank you. Let me see what else we have here. Another question was about increases in this person's region in terms of bootleg liquor. And I know in this context, we talked mostly about sales of licensed products, but did you have any comments about increases in that type of activity, maybe in any of your areas that you're familiar with?
Well, I'll just take that quick and then I'll pass it to Carrie. We at NACA just did a webinar and hosted one for NLLEA to speak, and there were a number of officers from Massachusetts and Virginia who spoke about direct shipping and their process of tracking down product that are coming from unlicensed shippers. And it's a very complicated process. It's not an easy one. Talk about resources. It takes a lot of resources to get that done. That webinar is archived on our website underneath the resource tab, and you can find that, and perhaps Rachel will plug it into the chat if she's still on. But that's an opportunity to watch that webinar to get a sense of what is happening out there. The regulatory levers I discussed are ways in which you can try to begin controlling that. Carrie, I don't know if you have more to add to that piece.
No, I think you covered it very well. I just think we're seeing a lot of pop-up rogue, even through Facebook with the pandemic, people selling alcohol that aren't licensed to sell alcohol. And so that can be a concern.
Yeah.
Thank you. let's see, here's a question about Uber specifically, where Uber and Lyft don't consider their drivers to be employees, but contract workers, and that are also not connected to retail stores the way the Drizzly couriers are. So how would you go about writing an enforcement ticket in those circumstances? And to whom would that ticket be directed?
So each state needs to, again, look at their statutes, but in North Carolina, at least, the delivery service itself is actually permitted. So Amazon is permitted as a delivery service permittee. So is Instacart, and I think there's a total of 14 in North Carolina, last checked. So what we would do is we would actually cite the courier if we were going to do a criminal charge for giving alcoholic beverages or delivering alcoholic beverages to the underage person. We would also then do a violation on the alcohol delivery service permittee for that offense, for delivering or giving alcoholic beverages to the underage person. Before this statute existed, creating that permit, there were discussions about not only citing the courier, but also potentially violating the retail establishment from where the alcoholic beverages came. So again, each state needs to look at how their law is set up and permitting and such.
Thank you. And I do think we have one other question here. We have 1 minute or so left if anyone has another question, but there was.
Kristen, while you look for that last question, I think there are some nuggets here to leave the audience with. And one is data collection, the importance of data collection, the kind of collection that Matt, Special Agent Stemple did in North Carolina is very helpful information to know how easy it is for minors to access alcohol in this fashion. That can arm prevention and public health with great data to be able to share as these debates happen in their state about whether to go down this path or not. And Carrie mentioned this about youth surveys. Currently, most national and state youth surveys do not track this access point for young people. And those are questions that it would be beneficial to know if in fact young people are accessing alcohol this way. There's only a handful of studies on this topic area, so researchers out there, if any are on this webinar, that is needed to better understand and get it in the peer-reviewed journal articles. Rebecca Williams out of UNC Chapel Hill is one of the only researchers we know tracking this. And when she started looking at online alcohol vendors, she had to stop counting at, I can't remember the number, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, that were out there. So there's a lot of opportunity here in terms of better understanding this landscape, and the policy certainly has moved faster than the data collection, which is typical. But folks on this webinar, these are things that you should be considering and thinking about as you move forward in your prevention work, and thinking creatively about compliance checks outside of the brick and mortar context, even though that's important as well.
Thank you, Cassie. That's a great point. I think that's especially, it's a nice way for those of us who are working on the prevention side to think about, that's really where our strengths are in terms of some of being able to do that data collection and then being able to share that information with policymakers as well as the enforcement agencies in your region. That's a great way to get involved. I did find our last question was similar to another one, but I think maybe Carrie, from your experience, you could talk a little bit about what your experiences working with local law enforcement at a city or county level in enforcing state alcohol laws for those, or Cassie, you might be able to jump into for states where local law enforcement are the ones doing the enforcement. Kind of a broad question.
So, I mean, working, whether it be with the state alcohol law enforcement or regulatory law enforcement or local law enforcement, I mean, I think you're going to approach it the same way. You need to have those conversations. A lot of times, if they aren't interacting with their bars and licensed establishments already, you can encourage them to do that through the data that you have. It might be, you know, inviting them to a coalition meeting and presenting the data to them and what you're seeing at your level, and then also letting them, you know, present what they're seeing at their level. I worked in a college town, and so our levels of underage drinking were always high, and we were always getting grant funding to, you know, help us with those issues. So, you know, we had put together a coalition, we put together an underage drinking task force, you know, we brought the youth in as well, and that always helps to get people to listen to, whether it be enforcement or your policymakers.
Thank you.